Aziza Mary, this is one of the deadliest mass shootings in the U.S. in years. The victims included 3 boys and 5 girls after a 31-year-old father took aim at his own young children.
Does it ever feel like some years arrive carrying more tragedy than anyone is prepared for? Not one tragedy, not 2, a chain of them. The kind that dominate headlines, flood social media feeds, and leave entire communities searching for answers that never seem to come. By the spring of 2026, many Americans already felt emotionally exhausted. Every few weeks, another devastating story appeared, another investigation, another family shattered, another set of questions nobody could answer. Then, before dawn on April 19th, a city in northwest Louisiana woke up to a nightmare that would quickly become one of the most disturbing family homicide cases in recent memory. Shreveport was still asleep. The streets were quiet. Most families were preparing for what they expected to be an ordinary Sunday morning. But inside a home on West 79th Street, something had already happened that would leave investigators, neighbors, and even seasoned law enforcement officers struggling to comprehend what they were seeing. At first, reports were confusing. A disturbance call, emergency responders rushing to a residential neighborhood, conflicting information coming over police radio traffic. Then the details began to emerge, one detail at a time, and each new fact seemed harder to process than the one before it. By sunrise, authorities had confirmed that multiple children were among the victims. Hours later, the full scope of the tragedy became clear. 8 children, 8 young lives, gone in a single morning. The ages ranged from just 3 years old to 11. The oldest had barely entered adolescence. The youngest had barely begun childhood. And at the center of the investigation stood a man who was not a stranger, not a random intruder, not an unknown suspect fleeing from another state. He was their father, a former National Guard soldier, a neighbor, a co-worker, a man many people believed they knew. His name was Shamarr Elkins. And almost immediately, one question consumed everyone following the case. Why? Why would a father do something that seemed impossible to understand? Why would someone described by neighbors as friendly, approachable, and devoted suddenly become the focus of one of the most heartbreaking investigations of the year? The first explanations appeared quickly. Domestic dispute, mental health struggles, marital problems, financial pressure. But the deeper investigators looked, the more complicated the picture became, because this story did not begin on April 19th. In many ways, it began years earlier, long before police cars arrived, long before emergency calls flooded dispatch centers, long before national media outlets descended on Shreveport. The clues were already there, scattered across different moments, different records, different conversations, pieces of the puzzle that nobody assembled in time. Some of those clues sat inside court documents. Others lived inside private family conversations. Some were buried in a criminal record. Others were hidden inside a mental health crisis that few people fully understood. And when those pieces are placed together, a very different story begins to emerge. Not a story about one morning, a story about years. Years of warning signs, years of pressure, years of decisions, and a final countdown that may have started long before anyone realized it. Before this case became national news, there was another reality that rarely made headlines. People who knew Shamarr Elkins did not describe him as someone openly preparing for violence. Many described the opposite. That contradiction is what makes this case so difficult. The public image and the private reality appear to tell 2 very different stories. And somewhere between those 2 stories lies the answer investigators have been trying to understand ever since. HI viewers, do you believe people usually hide their biggest struggles from everyone around them? Yes or no? Let us know in the comments. Because what happened next would force people to revisit years of memories, old conversations, past decisions, moments that seemed insignificant at the time. And one question would keep surfacing again and again. Could any of this have been prevented? As investigators reconstructed the timeline, they discovered that April 19th was not the first time serious concerns had surrounded Shamarr Elkins. It wasn't even the second. The deeper they dug, the more warning signs appeared. A criminal conviction, a firearms prohibition, threats that allegedly stayed inside the family and never reached authorities, a mental health crisis that brought him to a Veterans Affairs hospital months before the tragedy. Each discovery raised another question, and each answer seemed to reveal an even larger problem hiding underneath. But perhaps the most unsettling part of the story is how ordinary everything looked from the outside. Neighbors remembered seeing children playing. Co-workers remembered routine workdays. Family members remembered conversations that, at the time, did not seem extraordinary. Nothing about the final days suggested that one of the most devastating family tragedies in recent memory was approaching, at least not to the people standing closest to it. That is what makes this case different from many others. The ending shocked the nation, but the path leading toward that ending may have been years in the making. And to understand what happened on that Sunday morning, it is necessary to go back to the beginning, back before the headlines, back before the investigation, back before the tragedy became a national story. Because the man at the center of this case was not born into a police report. He was a child first, a son, a young man with a future. And the story of how Shamarr Elkins became the focus of this investigation begins long before anyone ever imagined his name would make national news. Shamarr Elkins was born on December 7th, 1994, in Shreveport, Louisiana. The city would eventually know his name for reasons nobody could have imagined, but that came much later, long before court records, long before investigators, long before national headlines. His story began inside a neighborhood called Cedar Grove. His biological mother, Shamarr Elkins, was young when she gave birth to him and struggled with addiction during those early years. Raising a child under those circumstances was difficult, and another woman stepped into a role that would shape much of his childhood. Her name was Betty Walker. To many people who later spoke about the case, Walker was more than a family friend. She was the person who gave Shamar structure, stability, consistency, the person who raised him. Years passed. As he entered adulthood, Elkins appeared to be moving toward a productive future. At 18 years old, he joined the Louisiana Army National Guard. For 7 years, he served in military roles that required discipline, training, and responsibility. He worked as a signal support system specialist. He also served as a fire support specialist. The positions required technical knowledge and the ability to operate under pressure. People who knew him during those years saw a young man building a future, not destroying one. When his military service ended in 2020, he returned home. Like thousands of veterans across America, he faced the challenge of transitioning back into civilian life. Public records reveal little about that transition. What is known is that he found work at UPS and began raising a growing family. From the outside, the image appeared ordinary. Work, family, children, responsibilities. The life many people strive to build. Co-workers described someone who often spoke about his children. Neighbors knew him by name. Nothing about those surface impressions suggested what investigators would later uncover. Yet there were signs, small ones, the kind that often make sense only after a tragedy. One co-worker, Willie Vasher, later recalled something unusual. Throughout work shifts, Elkins would repeatedly pull strands of hair from his head. Not once, not occasionally, regularly. The result became visible. A growing bald spot caused not by age, but by stress. At the time, it looked like an odd habit. Afterward, people saw it differently. By 2026, his life had become increasingly complicated. He shared children with 2 different households. One with his wife, Shine Pugh, another with his former wife, Christina Snow. Responsibilities existed in 2 places at once. Financial demands existed in 2 places at once. Emotional strain existed in 2 places at once. And while the people closest to him could see pressure building, few understood how deep those pressures might have become. Because one of the most important warning signs was hidden inside a criminal case that most people never connected to the larger story. And that warning sign would eventually raise a disturbing question. A question investigators are still examining today. If Shamarr Elkins was legally prohibited from possessing firearms, how was he able to obtain them at all? That question begins in 2019, years before the tragedy, years before most people were paying attention, and years before anyone imagined the consequences that could follow. In 2019, Elkins was involved in an incident that resulted in criminal charges. According to reports later cited by local media, the encounter occurred near Caddo Magnet High School. Authorities allege that shots were fired during the incident. Elkins later pleaded guilty to illegal use of a weapon. One charge was dismissed, but the conviction remained. And that conviction mattered a lot because under Louisiana law, it prohibited him from legally possessing firearms for years afterward. The restriction was not temporary confusion. It was not a misunderstanding. It was a matter of record. That fact alone changes how investigators view everything that followed. Because when authorities began examining the events of April 2026, they discovered that weapons had somehow entered the picture despite that prohibition. How? That answer led investigators toward another name, Charles Ford, a Shreveport resident with his own legal history. Federal authorities later charged Ford in connection with firearm-related allegations after tracing one of the weapons involved in the investigation. The allegations immediately expanded the scope of the case. Now, the questions were no longer limited to one person. Investigators wanted to understand the entire chain. Who possessed what? Who transferred what? And who knew what? Every answer seemed to generate 3 new questions. But even those developments would soon be overshadowed by a revelation far more alarming. Because while investigators reviewed records and evidence, family members were remembering conversations that had taken place years earlier, conversations nobody expected would become important. One conversation in particular, a conversation that would completely change how people interpreted everything that happened afterward. According to Betty Walker, a serious statement was made during 2023. At the time, tensions reportedly existed inside the marriage between Shamarr Elkins and Shinqua Pugh. The relationship was struggling. Discussions about separation had begun, and according to Walker's later account, Elkins reacted strongly to the possibility of losing his family. What happened next would become one of the most discussed details in the entire case. Walker told reporters that Elkins allegedly made a threat connected to the possibility of his wife leaving with the children. The statement was alarming, yet something important happened afterward. Nothing. No police report. No court filing. No official record. The conversation remained private, inside the family. And as months turned into years, the warning faded into the background. Life continued. The marriage continued. Then, in April 2024, the couple officially married. To many people, it may have appeared that whatever conflict existed had been resolved. But appearances can be deceptive, especially when deeper problems remain underneath. Researchers who study domestic violence have long identified separation and divorce as periods of elevated risk. The reason is not always anger. Sometimes it is control. Sometimes it is fear of losing control. And sometimes it is the inability to accept that a chapter of life is ending. Those factors do not guarantee violence. Far from it. But they appear often enough in case studies that investigators pay close attention whenever they surface. As 2025 became 2026, the marriage was again approaching a breaking point. Divorce proceedings moved forward. The relationship was nearing its legal conclusion. And around the same time, another development emerged. One that suggested the crisis may have extended beyond the marriage itself. In January 2026, Shamarr Elkins voluntarily checked himself into a Veterans Affairs hospital in Shreveport. Family members later stated that the visit followed a suicide attempt. That detail changed the narrative once again, because now the timeline contained another major warning sign, a serious mental health crisis. Reports indicate he remained there for approximately 10 days before being discharged. When he returned home, relatives believed he seemed better, calmer, more hopeful, at least temporarily. But hope and recovery are not always the same thing. Weeks later, concerns resurfaced. On Easter Sunday, April 5th, Elkins reportedly called family members while emotionally distressed. During the conversation, he spoke about personal struggles and dark thoughts connected to the divorce. His stepfather attempted to reassure him. The conversation eventually ended. No emergency response followed. No one could know what was coming. Most families receive difficult phone calls and never experience tragedy. That is what makes hindsight so powerful and so dangerous. Because once people know the ending, Every earlier moment suddenly appears significant. The hospitalization, the phone call, the reported threat, the criminal conviction. Each event begins looking like part of a larger pattern. The problem is that nobody sees the entire pattern while it's happening. Only afterward. As April 2026 progressed, the divorce proceedings moved closer to completion. A court date approached. Family tensions remained unresolved. Questions remained unanswered. And then came the final weekend. On the afternoon of April 18th, a neighbor remembered seeing children outside playing. Nothing unusual, nothing alarming, just another day. Later that evening, Elkins reportedly spent time with one of his daughters and shared a smiling social media post. Again, nothing appeared extraordinary. Hours later, relatives recalled normal conversations, normal interactions, normal behavior. The final evening looked remarkably ordinary. That detail continues to haunt many people connected to the case because it challenges a common assumption, the assumption that major tragedies announce themselves beforehand. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. By the early morning hours of April 19th, emergency calls began reaching authorities. As investigators pieced together the timeline, they learned that two locations would become central to the case. One connected Christina Snow, the other connected to the West 79th Street residence. By the end of that morning, 8 children had lost their lives, while both mothers survived despite serious injuries. The nation focused on what happened. Investigators focused on why. And as the weeks passed, the deeper story became less about a single morning and more about a chain of missed opportunities stretching back years. A prior conviction, an alleged threat, a mental health crisis, a pending divorce, a firearms prohibition, 5 separate pieces of information, 5 separate systems, 5 separate moments, never fully connected. Even today, multiple investigations remain tied to different aspects of the case. Questions about firearm access, questions about decision-making, questions about intervention, questions about prevention, and perhaps the most difficult question of all, which warning sign mattered most? Because somewhere inside that answer may be a lesson capable of preventing future tragedies. But the story is not over, not even close. In the next video, the focus shifts to a detail many viewers overlook. The exact sequence of events during the final 48 hours before April 19th, including the conversation, the social media post, and the timeline investigators believe may reveal when this tragedy stopped being a possibility and became a plan. And one specific detail from the final dinner outing has continued raising questions that investigators have never fully answered.